Hello everyone, today we are going to be having a look at the Poem of Return by Jofre Rocha. In terms of context, Geoffrey Rocher was a political activist who participated in the guerrilla warfare for the liberation of his country, which was Angola. And between 1961 and 1968, Geoffrey Rocha was a political prisoner. And it was at this time that he achieved some of his academic qualifications. And after the independence of Angola in 1975, Rocher, as an active member of the ruling party, the MPLA, held several government positions. And his Poem of Return is one of his poems inspired by his days in exile from his land of birth. If you're not aware of what exile is when people choose to leave their country, usually because of political unrest, in order to keep safe. Some of the themes that we deal with in this poem are the themes of alienation or estrangement, which really does prevail throughout the poem as the speaker yearns to be updated about what has happened at home when he was in exile. We also look at the themes of nostalgia, so missing something from the past, the themes of unfulfilled dreams of victory, admiration, sorrow, and patriotism and sacrifice. In terms of the type of poem, this is a poem typical of a poem of exile or resistance poetry that is characterized by the theme of estrangement and alienation. And Rocher wrote this poem when he was in exile, as I said earlier, as a result of fear of imprisonment by the Portuguese regime during the liberation struggle in Angola. And a key point to note about this type of poem is the use of the pseudonym by the poet. So his real name isn't actually Jofre Rocha. He used that name as a way of protecting his identity whilst in exile. And this was also used by the poet because he was under intense censorship in his home country. And by using a pseudonym, it offered the poet a means to express his ideas discreetly. While this poem does have 14 lines, it's important to note that it is not a sonnet. In fact, it doesn't follow any kind of strict rhyme scheme or structure. There is, however, a lot of enjambment within the poem, so that's where one line runs onto the next to complete a thought. It's divided into 3 stanzas of unequal length. And in each stanza, the speaker expresses different ideas about what he anticipates when he gets home from exile. And as I've said in a previous video, and I will repeat this in probably all my videos, especially for matrics, it is important that you understand the poem's intention. Obviously, the context is also important because it ties in with the author's intention. With regard to the intention of this poem, it is to highlight the fact that the true heroes in a war of liberation are those who remained in their land of birth, those who stayed behind to fight for freedom. Hence why our speaker insists on not being given a heroic welcome, because he understands that by going into exile, he was unable to fight for the liberation of his country, and therefore he is not a hero. I'll remind you again of the color key that I use when I annotate my poems, and I'll also remind you that diction is specific word choice, imagery is to do with figures of speech, and more than one word descriptors. Structure is to do with the structure of the poem, as well as punctuation and things like enjambment. Tone is the speaker's attitude towards the subject, and mood is the overall atmosphere. And I will be highlighting everything to do with diction in pink, everything to do with imagery in green, structure will be in red, tone will be in orange, and mood will be in purple. So let's jump into stanza 1. When I return from the land of exile and silence, do not bring me flowers. So it's interesting to note that the poet starts his poem with the word when. So there's an absolute certainty that he will return from his land of exile and silence. And he describes exile as the land of exile and silence because This is the place that the speaker is now, and it is a foreign place where the speaker feels restricted and alone. He is away from his country of birth. And the speaker experiences pain and suffering while isolated and away from his family, friends, and his country. However, he does remind us later in the poem that he does not suffer as much as those who stayed behind have suffered. And he says, "Do not bring me flowers." So flowers are a symbol of celebration, but he asks not to be brought flowers when he returns home. The speaker does not want to be seen as a hero or acknowledged to be a hero. He feels immense guilt for leaving his country while others stayed behind to fight for freedom. And he uses the imperative, "do not." So imperative obviously being a command. So his tone over here is very commanding in his instruction of not being treated like a hero when he returns to his home country. In stanza 2, he says, "Bring me rather all the dews, tears of dawns which witnessed dramas. Bring me the immense hunger for love and the plaint of tumid sexes in star-studded night. Bring me the long night of sleeplessness, with mothers mourning, their arms bereft of sons." So we've got the repetition of "bring me." So he uses the imperative again, only this time he uses the imperative to speak about what he would rather be brought. And over here, he would rather be brought the things that remind him about his reason for exile. So his reason for exile obviously being the fact that his home country was in political turmoil. And he says the dews. So dews, if we think about dewdrops on grass in the morning, it connotes a fresh start, it connotes hope. But at the same time, it could also connote tears of sadness. As we know, there was incredible injustice that had occurred in his home country, which was Angola. And it's almost like even nature is mourning, as it has been the one to witness the suffering, not the poet himself. And that idea is carried through when he describes tears of dawns. So this is personification. The dawn weeps as it witnesses the tragedies of war, which he himself has not witnessed. And we've got alliteration with dews, dawns, and dramas. And dramas really contrast dews and dawns, because dews, as we said earlier, connotes a fresh start. Dawn has a connotation of a new beginning. But dramas really indicates the hopelessness of a fresh start due to the current violence and tragedy of war. So he wants to be brought the experience of those who stayed behind, the experience of suffering. We have the repetition of "bring me," so his command. So this is an example of anaphora. And through repeating "bring me," it's like he is pleading. He does not want to be brought flowers. He does not want to be celebrated. He pleads to be brought the experience of those he views as heroes. And by using this repeated imperative, we get our tone, our commanding tone. And if we have a look at the immense hunger for love, that phrase over there just shows us that he yearns for connection. He's hungry for connection, which he has not experienced in exile because he's been incredibly isolated. And stanza 2 continued. I just didn't want to overwhelm all of you with so many notes on stanza 2 in the last slide. So when we've got that term, that phrase, immense hunger for love, and the plaint, we see a piece of enjambment over here. So we can imagine that the writer chose to use enjambment to emphasize his longing. It's almost like he is listing all the things that he would rather be brought. It also ties into that pleading tone that we spoke about earlier. And he says, and he wants the plaint of tumid sexes and star-studded night. So we know that the immense hunger for love was his yearning of connection, which he is deprived of in exile. But over here, he even wishes for the arguments between lovers that occur at night. Tumid and star-studded nights suggest that these arguments are passionate. We can imagine that they were very intense arguments going back in his home country as people were experiencing this political turmoil. And it also emphasizes his yearning for loved ones again. Like he feels really isolated in exile. And then he also longs for long nights of sleeplessness. So back home, people would have been incredibly worried about the safety of their loved ones as they fought for independence, and he wants to experience that himself. And the use of the word long over there also highlights that pain and suffering continued for a very long time, but he missed out on that. He chose to go into exile. And the image of mother's mourning, I mean, it is a piece of alliteration, but it again reminds us of the suffering that was going on back home. And he wants to share the mourning of mothers who have lost their sons. He believes they are the true heroes of war, not himself. And the image of mothers who are mourning with their arms bereft of sons is also incredibly emotional. I mean, using the word bereft means that they are deprived of their sons who have probably lost their lives because of the fight for independence. And using that emotive word, bereft, really emphasizes the suffering that he is aware of, and that he is also aware of being lucky enough to escape. Looking at stanza 3, when I return from the land of exile and silence, do not bring me flowers, bring me only just this, the last wish of heroes fallen at daybreak, with a wingless stone in hand and a thread of anger snaking from their eyes. So in this final stanza of the poem, he once again highlights what it is that he wants to be brought. And he highlights again for the reader that he does not consider himself to be a hero and focuses instead of the people who stayed behind. He repeats the first two lines of the poem to emphasize that his return should not be celebrated. Exile is not a pleasant experience for him, but he did not suffer as much as those who stayed behind. And we've got a double negative over here where he says, no, do not. So he reinforces that the speaker does not regard himself as a hero. In fact, he feels an immense sense of guilt for not staying behind to help in the fight for freedom. And we've got ellipsis. So the use of ellipsis creates a dramatic pause. It creates anticipation for the reader. Almost anticipate what else does he want to be brought. And it also, allows his message to linger a bit and emphasize that he does not want to be celebrated, and rather he wants the focus to be on the true heroes. And what does he want? He says, bring me only just this. So the use of redundancy over there, remember redundancy is the repetition, unnecessary repetition. That will also be a good reminder for your paper 1 exam. And again, he uses redundancy over here to emphasize that he only wants one thing, and he wants the last wish of heroes fallen at daybreak. So we imagine that the last wish is the change that people wanted, the change that people were willing to fight and even die for. And heroes fallen, we could say that is an example of euphemism, but it's a euphemism for being killed. These heroes have been killed by the opposition. And these are freedom fighters that have fought very hard and risked their lives. So they are the heroes. And they were killed at daybreak. They were killed at the start of their lives, at the brink of change. And I really want you to grapple with this image of a wingless stone in hand. If we think about a wingless stone, it is a weapon waiting to be used in a hopeless battle. These people did not get to cast their stone, but died fighting for their freedom. And many people lost their opportunity to fight. They were killed before they had any chance to defend themselves. and they have a thread of anger snaking from their eyes. So this is the anger felt by all who were oppressed and fought for freedom. And the fact that there is just a thread of anger implies that there was only a fragment of anger was able to be shown before they were killed. So Rocher really paints a picture of devastation, of both hope for freedom and hopelessness in almost a futile battle. And these two images are incredibly powerful and incredibly important to the poem's context and intention. So the speaker wants their sacrifice to be remembered. He emphasizes that throughout the poem. He doesn't want to be remembered. He has done nothing that is worthy of recognition, but the people who stayed behind are worthy of recognition, and he yearns for that experience of suffering instead, because he feels such immense guilt for not staying behind. And we can say that the tone of the final stanza is a tone of anger and bitterness. So that is the end of Poem of Return. I hope that you all enjoyed listening to this lesson. I hope it has helped you in your revision of the poem, if that's what you're using this video for. And as I said, just say in all of my videos, if you have any questions, any comments, please don't hesitate to make a comment below this video, and I can try and get back to you and try and help you with further understanding of the poem.